Okay, Lucy Wyatt. Oh, we'll do this. Lucy Wyatt, we're in your home in the West Country.
Indeed, we are.
Is that right?
Yeah, indeed we are, Miles. And very
And
pleased
you're
to
a
see
troublemaker.
you're too
You're
kind.
also a mathematician.
I don't know. I
No,
wouldn't go that far.
you didn't.
No.
You knew how to add one and one in complex numbers.
That's arithmetic. Yeah, very complex numbers. No, I'd say I was more a cultural historian, and that what interests me is
That's a bit bloody la-di-da.
Oh, very la-di-da. That what interests me is trying to get deep into the roots of things, and as you probably know, Miles, back in 2010, I published a book called "Approaching Chaos: Could an Ancient Archetype Save 21st Century Civilization?" And the gist of this book was that if our civilization collapsed, how would we go about restarting things? And in order to find out, I went back to the end of the Ice Age to look at how cities came about and how we got to the milkable cow and modified grains and that kind of thing. And I came to the conclusion that pharaohs are shaman and that they know how to access the blueprint for civilization. That was the result of my work in 2010, which I published. The book is still on Amazon, but I don't know there are many copies about anymore. Anyway, I didn't at the time have a serious handle on my current present of mind, because what changed for all of us was what happened to us in 2020. 2020, for me, as for many, was a big wake-up call, because then I began to really fully understand the role of malevolence. In 2010, when I first was writing about civilization, I had no concept of the malevolence that exists in our society. For me, this malevolence is a human malevolence, and it's very pernicious. So since 2020, I've been on a mission to try and understand the background to that. And the conclusion that I came to, based on research I discovered last summer, was that particularly in England, we have been manipulated by a particularly evil set of people who originated in Venice, and they started to take an interest in England as far back as Henry VIII. So this is a very ongoing, long-standing influence that they've had over us. And it's partly why the British developed an empire, and partly why the British have developed as they have, and why global politics pretty much have happened as they have, all the wars and this kind of thing. Because what this group of people were interested in was how to acquire access to resources. And the resource that particularly, especially interests them are humans, human trafficking. Now, to say a few words of background about these Venetians, they originated in Rome. And they left Rome when Rome fell at the end of the 4th century AD. And they fled to Venice, because Venice at the time was mosquito-infested islands. Nobody was going to pursue them there. And so they were relatively safe. And from there, they tried as best they could to recreate the Roman Empire with their trading networks. And then sometime around the end of the 15th century, they had so annoyed all their neighbours in Europe that they ganged up on them, and they wanted to get rid of these horrible Venetians who had very unpleasant ways of doing things. Their MO is things like espionage, blackmail, assassination. They don't come at you straight. They come at you in a very devious kind of way. So most of the major powers in Europe formed this thing called the League of Cambrai in 1508. And the only major power not to join was the British Empire, the British Kingdom rather, Henry VIII. he was the only person who didn't join to attack the Venetians. And so they thought, he's obviously of interest. So they got to know him pretty well. And they were very helpful to him in his divorce, and helped to smooth out everything with the Pope and put together the arguments for him and so forth. And then so over the time, they had a foothold in England, and they were still around when his daughter Elizabeth I came to the throne. And so they encouraged her in the beginnings of a British Empire. The first step in that was the creation of the East India Company in 1600. But slowly over time, that became the biggest trading company in the world, covering all the different continents. And so it was exactly what the Venetians wanted. They also helped to create the Dutch East India Company as well. London wasn't their only base, but they taught the British their statecraft. One of their key people was Sir Francis Bacon, and he was trained in espionage and all the rest of it. And one of the things that they were particularly interested in doing was the psychological operation. And what's curious about them is that they deliberately decided to take an interest in science. And this goes back to before Bacon. They were not happy about the discoveries that Johannes Kepler was making back in the 16th century. At the time, telescopes were getting better and people were able to observe more about the cosmos. And what they were discovering was that instead of everything being inert and just blobs in the sky, there were all these movements. And what Kepler was talking about were harmonies, a very Platonic approach to science. And this did not appeal to the Venetians at all. They particularly wanted you not to believe in a harmonious universe. So they deliberately encouraged Galileo in their fight with Kepler in order to drown the noise of Kepler out of Europe. And Galileo in particular had interest and influence over Francis Bacon as well. I go into detail in this in my Substack articles. And then all these particular characters died, and the person who then carried on with the work of Kepler was Gottfried Leibniz. So what the Venetians did is that they were not at all happy about Leibniz having this idea of harmony and so forth. So they deliberately encouraged Isaac Newton in his fight with Leibniz. In 1715, they sent the Abbé Conti, a Venetian prelate, deliberately to London in order to befriend Isaac Newton so that he would prevail in the row about calculus and that Leibniz's name would be rubbished. This was conscious. This was very deliberate indeed. And as a consequence, the Newtonian approach to the cosmos prevailed for centuries. And even now, we're still suffering the legacy of that. And what the Venetians were keen on was the idea that we have no responsibility for each other. We're just blobs. We have no conscience. It's all clockwork. It's all mechanical. Nothing's our fault. And there's no altruism. And interestingly, it's from around that time, around 1715, that very respectable people like Dr. Irma Gilchrist date the predominance of left-brain thinking. And left-brain thinking is what suits the Venetians, because left-brain thinking is all about reductionism, it's all about everything being catalogued, itemized, isolated, disconnected. This is what the Venetians want. They want a psychological atmosphere of disassociation and disconnection, so that we don't notice what's going on in the world, and we don't take any responsibility, and we don't reach out to our fellow citizens. And we saw that exactly play out in the pandemic of 2020, when we were literally cut off from people. So that was pure, I call them the doom cult, that was pure doom cult activity, the pandemic. But the point is if you don't go back far enough in history and you don't look into this, you don't really understand what the motives are, and you don't really understand quite how they operate. History tells you more about the detail of how these people think and what matters to them and what they're trying to achieve. So that's why I go back so far into history. Does that explain a bit, Miles?
I think that's absolutely fantastic.
I mean, that's really what I'm writing about. And so I now have a Substack page which is called Chaos Encountered, where I write up all my research on this, and I look at what's going on in the current politics as well, geopolitics, as well as the historical angle. But I think if you don't look into the history of it, and you don't appreciate that malevolence drives so much, you really miss it. You really do.
But this is also to do with Francis Bacon. This is more
Francis
stuff coming out
Bacon,
about Francis Bacon.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because he was totally.
And he wrote Shakespeare, unlike Eric.
Well, yeah, that's my view too. That he was the author of Shakespeare. He may have worked with other people. He may have pulled in other people to help him. And there's even clear evidence of the influence of the Venetians on his work. For example, I can give you one instance, which is to do with.
I'm going to ask you, how close is Francis Bacon to this Saint Germain character?
I can't really answer that.
It's meant to be bouncing through lifetimes.
Yeah,
anyway.
I can't answer that because I don't really know enough. And the thing is that, although I'm aware of the views about Saint Germain, but I can't really tell you how that reincarnation thing works.
Okay.
But to give you an example of the influence of the Venetians on Bacon, there are older versions of the play Hamlet in which there are references to the moon having an impact on the tides, which was the view that Kepler had. He had the view that the moon affects the tides. Now, the Venetians didn't like that, so they got Galileo to change Francis Bacon's view of this, and later versions of Hamlet, after a certain date, are completely rewritten to take out that standard view that we all accept, that the moon affects the tides. That's just one concrete example of their impact on him. So he was definitely very useful to them, and there's no doubt about it, and helped to frame a lot of how we think about science.
Well, how does that work now? Because obviously we now say that the moon does affect tides.
They're saying it doesn't.
No, it does.
Yes, exactly.
But
this shows
how
you
did that work then?
Well, this shows you the power of the influence of these Venetians on Bacon, that they were able to persuade him that it wasn't the case, because they did not want the science of Kepler to dominate.
Now, explain to those who don't know about Kepler what are the fundamental differences in those two views about what Kepler did and
what Kepler did.
Yeah. I mean, what's his stuff?
Well, his
why
stuff.
did they want that?
The point. Well, to wind it back even further, there are two quite contrasting views that were present in the Middle Ages, which is to do with Aristotle and Plato and Pythagoras. So Aristotle took this view that we are born as blank slates, that we have no memories, therefore we have no responsibility for anything. We are like atoms just bouncing around. Whereas Plato took the view that we are part of a harmonious whole, that there is a bigger world out there than just us, and that we do have morality, and that we do have an innate goodness in us. So the Venetians were particularly keen to promote Aristotle because he could help to justify things like slavery. And so they were happy that Galileo carried on with the Aristotelian view of science, whereas Kepler was promoting a more Platonic view of science. That's a major reason why they were very anti-Kepler. As I said, to do with this, how planets move, and he was, to give you for instance, on the planetary thing, we know that the orbit of Venus follows the Fibonacci series. So there's a kind of 3 by 5 by 8. I can't remember exactly how it works, but in terms of how the Earth and Venus join together in a dance around the sun. So it's an actual example of harmony at work. And this is the kind of thing that Kepler knew about and was promoting. So he threatened their horrible isolationist, reductionist, cold, dead universe approach. And that's when later Newton picked up on that, talking about it as a clockwork universe, and there was no relationship in how the planets moved around. And
but meanwhile, Newton is doing alchemy, and his laws of gravity are not gravity, but it's electric field.
That's
so on one
true.
level, you've got two things going on.
Yes, but I mean, even Newton's alchemy, I don't, because I have a different view of alchemy. My view of alchemy is that what the ancient Egyptians understood about alchemy is different to how we understand alchemy. How we understand alchemy, I think, is to do with how the substance is produced. Could be gold or whatever it is. That's what we understand about alchemy. Whereas actually what the Egyptians understood about alchemy is to do with a process. And the process is actually a shamanic process, and the substance was just used to help that shamanic process. The shamanic process is to do with going out of body, and as a shaman would look for a fixed point, which in the case of the Egyptians were the imperishable northern stars, the fixed stars. And this information is written up on the walls of the pyramid at Saqqara, the pyramid texts, where it talks about flying up as a falcon, flying up as a bird, and visiting these fixed stars. Now, the important thing to note is that the Egyptian name for these fixed stars is the Chemi. So they were going al to the Chemi, al-Chemi. Chemi's got nothing to do with Black Lands or any of these other interpretations. I don't personally believe that Newton knew how to do any of that. I don't think he was a shaman. I don't think that his alchemy went any further than just trying to produce the substance. And it's known that he set fire to his rooms at Trinity College, Cambridge, with his Athanor. And he was also master of the mint, so he clearly had an interest in gold and that kind of thing. But I don't think he was in the Egyptian mould of working with alchemy. So what Webster Tarpley, who's my main source for a lot of the information I have about the Venetians, says about Isaac Newton is that he was a kook, and that he should have just stayed as an obscure troublemaker in East Anglia, that he was really a wash-up, that he didn't have any real science to give us. And it's only because of the Venetians that he came to prominence. I think we should take that seriously and re-examine everything to do with him.
Well, that
because
would attack a lot of the fundamental laws of physics.
yeah, exactly. But
Which,
a lot of
wouldn't be
the
the first
fundamental
time
laws of
physics has
physics,
been gerrymandered.
without a doubt. I mean, even something like entropy. Entropy doesn't really kind of necessarily work. It relies on a Big Bang kind of theory. So how can you have a universe that's expanding after a Big Bang and then dying because of entropy? I don't buy that at all. To me, that's all part of this depressing view of the world that the Venetians have wanted to promote.
Well, I think when they're using Big Bang and those kind of childish concepts, it should tell you the quality of the science they're dealing with.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to give you another example, for example, with quasars and so forth, there's this idea that quasars are you can measure them in terms of the distance from the sun or whatever, because they're in theory moving, and that's supposed to be a way of measuring the universe. But as Alton Harp suggests, the rebel astronomer, they actually show that they're just young. That's why you get redshift. It's to do with the age, not to do with movement. So,
but explain this term, rebel astronomers.
Rebel astronomer. Well, Alton Harp, he had been very much a well-respected astronomer. He was responsible for some massive encyclopedia to do with stars and so forth. But once he started to question things like redshift...
what era are we talking about here?
I suppose it would be, I don't know, 1960s, 70s?
Right, so
modern, 20th century. He was then denied time on telescopes. They proper ostracised him. So instead of saying, oh, has this person got an interesting view? Is he challenging the orthodoxy? Should we look at it? No, they just do the usual cancel, censor, get rid of somebody. That's the kind of science we're dealing with. So I think the important thing with science is to say who's paying, who's behind it, who benefits from the science that's being produced, and to make the clearest point, Miles, is climate change. Who's behind all of that? We've been forced to live with this complete scam.
Well, a non-biological, a non-carbon-based life form wouldn't like carbon.
Wouldn't like carbon.
Yeah. So if you wish to reduce carbon, you wish to reduce and get rid of all organic life. Therefore, you're not of organic life.
Well, this is what the doom cult is about, because they're really about death, dying and destruction and anything dreadful beginning with a D. And we see their fingers on so much. The pandemic was a classic example of what they do, or what they did, what they're capable of doing.
What do you see the current situation? Okay, we're dealing with March 2025. What do you see happening in that?
Well, I'm kind of hopeful. I live in optimism. I'm kind of hopeful that it's possible. There's always a possibility that the Trump administration is on the case of all of this, that they are engaged. This is the benign view, the Trump administration, that they are engaged in a massive battle to try to eliminate these ghastly people from our lives and our minds, because it's our minds that they really go out of their way to poison. Certainly there's been big steps forward in America to clean out the deep state, and as a consequence the deep state is fighting back. And I think it's also very interesting in the way that there's been a certain coolness or shift in the relationship between America and Britain.
Effects of things with Britain. Bearing in mind date time is March 2025.
Yeah. So the key thing to remember here is that the Doom cult was behind the British Empire. And as far as I can tell, the most important breakaway from the Doom cult, from the British Empire, was what happened in 1776, when the Americans did what they did. So there was a time when America was genuinely free of the Doom cult. And then what the British tried to do over centuries was to get the Americans back on board. And it's to go back to 1776 and what happened after that. The Monroe Doctrine, which came about in 1820, inspired by one of Sandy Adams' relations, John Adams, I think it was. The Monroe Doctrine was basically saying to Europe, you keep out of our affairs, we'll keep out of your affairs. What's on the American continent is only what's of interest to us. We're not going to get involved in your wars, you keep out of our wars. And the Monroe Doctrine held until the First World War. So that was from 1820 to the First World War. But even at the time of the American Civil War, which was in theory a proxy war between the Americans in the North and the British, who were supporting the South, what's of interest is that the Russians came to the aid of the Americans in the North and turned the Civil War in their favour. The Tsar at the time, Alexander II, he sent the Imperial Russian fleet to the east coast and the west coast of America, thus making it more difficult for the British Navy to be active. This is a very key thing to know, because it speaks to why the Americans are interested in talking to the Russians now. Because one of the things that the Doom cult, the British Empire, never wants is for the Americans and the Russians to align, to realise that they have common interests. So Britain, having lost America pretty much throughout most of the 19th century, around the turn of the 20th century, started to put things in place to get America back into the fold. And that's when we see people like J.P. Morgan, whose father had been in banking in London, start to become important, influential, and things like the Round Table movement that was thought up by
Also the
Cecil
banjacking
Rhodes.
of physics,
Say again?
how the fundamentals of physics were changed
Yeah, all sorts of things were changed.
in terms of Maxwell's equations and how we generate electricity. And
Well, quite. Yeah, I'm a bit shaky on all of that. I'm really more looking at the politics. And so they set up things like the Pilgrim Society, which still exists, and were working closely with certain American financial interests to destroy Russia. So this is a common theme that's been going on for a long time. And throughout the 19th century, various aristocratic interests, various aristocrats were behind the support for Karl Marx and ideas about communism. Even Lord Alfred Milner, who was very instrumental in setting up the Round Table movement, he's on record in a lecture that he gave in the 1880s of praising Karl Marx, of saying how communism was the ultimate form of human society. So these people had devious motives in encouraging Marxism and communism, and they used it to great effect to destroy Russia from within. It was the British and certain American interests who helped to make that happen in 1917. And then 1919, an outpost of Yale University in Beijing, then known as Peking, befriended the young Mao Zedong, and we know what happened 20 years later when China also similarly was destroyed with the use of communism. So the Doom cult's been in operation for a very long time, and it's very difficult to get it out of our system because they've used all sorts of brainwashing ways to get into people's heads. The climate scam is just one of their more recent iterations, this completely false notion that if we stop using fossil fuels we can save the planet, which is so clearly not true when, as you say, Miles, carbon is so essential to all forms of life on this planet. So what way they've used that is a way of green colonialism, a way of keeping economies, including our own, in a kind of backwardness. We can't prosper. African continental countries can't prosper. Nobody's allowed to, apart from the ones who break free. And that's why we've seen Russia, who was kicked out of SWIFT and who had all these sanctions, why we've seen Russia blossom since they really have started to be separate from the whole global system. And we shouldn't ignore these things, whether you think Russia is evil or not evil. We need to look at our own country. How evil is that? We send to prison someone for contempt of court and put them into solitary confinement for 18 months, and we don't put in prison somebody who's caught with pornographic pictures on their phone of children. That's the kind of people we are, and we complain about other countries having poor levels of justice. So we definitely need some sort of change here, without a doubt. And I'm hopeful that the Trump regime, even though it's going to hit lots of difficult turns, and I can see why people are very concerned about what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. It's definitely a mess. But I would say that if the Americans were serious about taking out the Houthis, and they allegedly have a lot of technical capability, then why are they only bombing half derelict, half occupied civilian buildings and not military establishments? It's either incompetence or they're not genuine about actually wanting to destroy the Houthis. So it's making me wonder if there isn't a deeper game being played here. Obviously it's not good when innocent people are killed, but there's a deeper game which is perhaps maybe what the good people want is the end of Israel completely. It's failed in its mission to become the fixed aircraft carrier of the Middle East. It hasn't managed to guarantee the open trade routes. The Suez Canal is closed effectively to Western trade. So it's failed in its mission there, and it's done nothing but create hostility from all its neighbours, and not even built a safe homeland for the Jewish population. And in fact, it's rumoured that a lot of Parisian Jews have moved to London because what's going on in Israel has made them feel so unsafe in Paris. So I'd say a complete failure. And I don't say that as anybody who bears any hatred for Jewish people. I think they're wonderful. But this Zionism is not doing them any favours at all. And so you have to wonder if there aren't some deeper machinations going on, and that maybe things will really take a turn for the better once America and Russia have got relations between each other on a better footing.
Well, Lucy, why?
Miles.
It's getting a little bit nippy.
It is getting a bit
Thank
nippy.
you for
it's very al
hosting
fresco
us
here.
today.
No, my pleasure. Thank you, Miles, for dropping by.
To make a great baked
Anytime.
potato.
Yeah, anytime.
And we'll call that a day.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I hope that was good.